Welcome everyone to Cornell Keynotes. Today we are looking at the experience of online hiring of people with disabilities, both on the employer and on the employee side. We'll begin by discussing why and how employers should recruit applicants with disabilities, then move on to how to fine-tune various hiring processes, and ultimately we'll closely examine the self-identification process to potential employers during the application process itself. We are joined by one of my favorite Cornell keynote guests, Susanne Bruyère, who is Professor of Disability Studies and the Academic Director at the Yang Tan Institute at Cornell's ILR School. Susanne, great to have you in the studio once again.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be back.
I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Professor Bruyère is also faculty author of the Workplace Disability Inclusion and also the Neurodiversity at Work courses, in addition to other courses as part of Cornell's HR certificate programs offered through eCornell. We'll share a couple of those URLs with you through the conversation as well. So Susanne, you're back in the studio today. It was 33 degrees below freezing today, which puts us at 18 degrees Celsius. You know, we've got an international audience, pretty chilly. Thank you for making it over. You came in, the cold was coming right off of you when I met you downstairs, but we're both alive and we're here to do it.
Yes.
Viewers, hope you're staying cozy wherever you may be. We're going to take your questions in the chat and stand by for several resources in the several resources in the form of URLs that we're going to be sharing in the chat. We've got some really good resources that Susanne has provided for us to share with you, right? So you'll have a lot of good actionable next steps after this conversation. So Susanne, let's go high level here. Generally, what is the experience like for people with disabilities who are applying online for jobs? What's it like out there?
Great question, Chris, and something we've been thinking about a lot the last couple of years in response to employer interests about what can they do to more effectively, affirmatively recruit. And so we at Cornell University have been thinking about that. We've done some interviews with people, we've done some surveys with job seekers with disabilities, and they tell us there definitely are signals in career pages, signals on company websites that encourage them to apply or discourage them from pursuing that employer for employment. Sometimes it's just, how they view the website, the information provided. In some cases, websites are also very difficult to navigate, and people get discouraged just from trying to figure out how to apply. But indeed, it can be problematic and discourage lost talent left on the table.
I want to get to that. So that's a through line almost in every conversation we have, right? We talk about why it's critical or strategically important for organizations and companies to hire disabled people, to look at that as a valuable talent pool. And if you're not tapping that, you're leaving a lot of talent on the table.
Absolutely, absolutely. We know that about 11% of working age Americans are people with disabilities. Half of those people are actually getting into the workforce, even though they are eligible, they're interested, often they're trained up for it. And so the work of the Yang Tan Institute has been to try to figure out where those barriers are, both for the job seekers, but also in the employment setting. How are we inadvertently and often disproportionately keeping people out of those pipelines where we can access that talent?
So let's talk about the experience of job seekers with disabilities online. You had kind of described high level what the landscape looks like, but how might somebody go about this? What kind of blockers do they typically run into?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that we can talk about. In our research, we did ask people how they pursue jobs, and I would say half of them. We surveyed almost 900 individuals who are job seekers, who are people with disabilities who'd had recent experience, and we found out that I would say almost about half of them use social media. I think it's good for employers to know it's not just their web pages. They should, if they're recruiting other ways, signaling in that social media outreach that people with disabilities, people who are neurodivergent, are a part of the different pools of talent that they're looking for, but where their own web pages, the company web pages and the career web pages are concerned, candidates have told us that they they look for navigability, which I already mentioned. For people with visual impairments or hearing impairments, it's accessibility. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But for in the general population, people are looking for signals about how their talents fit the open positions, but also how the culture of the organization fit what they're looking for in terms of really being included. Is the employer signaling that they want people with disabilities? Is it in their diversity statement? Is there a statement by the CEO that it's a part of the strategic imperative? And do they see themselves in the candidates, how is it reflected in the imagery on the website?
And that's what I was getting at, or more so what I intended to ask, which are, what is something either in the imagery or the messaging that either indicates promise, right, for an organization, kind of like what you described, or red flags? What might be some red flags that, as an employer, both on the employer side and on the employee side, what should we all be looking for?
Well, I think all of us look to see ourselves, right, when we're looking at an employer. Is this a place that has similar values? Is this a place that wants someone like me? And I mentioned a couple of things. Statement by the CEO that this is affirmative hiring for people with disabilities. It's part of the strategic plan for the organization, but there are many other things that send signals about disability being a part of the agenda. It might be an affirmative hiring portal for people with disabilities where recruiters are actually looking for these candidates.
What is an affirmative hiring portal? What is it? How does it work?
It means that rather than just having the generic application process or career pages, that there are separate entries that say if you're an individual with disability and you'd like consideration, please apply here, so that the recruiters it's probably more likely it's an individual and not an algorithmic screening that is occurring. And recruiters or hiring managers who know that the company is affirmatively looking to draw from this talent pool. And so will give personal attention to the resumes coming through that portal. So that's a significant signal to the individual that candidates like themselves are wanted in that organization to apply. And also community organizations that are partners to these companies and provide qualified candidates as a part of the labor force pipeline. All of these things signal that this is an organization that is affirmatively recruiting people with disabilities.
Good. So these are high-level indicators, a good general practice to think about.
Absolutely.
So you have this, you talk about this idea of distinguishing between instrumental parts of the job, and I'm talking about the job description right now, right? Factual and objective job attributes. What are the things that you're going to do? Distinguishing between the instrumental and the symbolic, the subjective attributes. The idea of the company personality, values, culture, and all those kind of things. Can you just talk about how those two things are distinguishable? And as someone who's creating a job listing or coming up with a position description, what those things look like and why they're both so critical as part of the mix?
Yeah, and you are absolutely right. They are both critical, Chris. Yeah. People want to understand what the job is, right? And be able to make an informed judgment about whether their skills and interests and their talents match a specific job description. So enough specificity is really important so the person can make an informed judgment. What we do hear from candidates is that sometimes the specificity is in such great detail that they're put off. They feel like they cannot approximate all of the expectations, and any other of us sweep aside some of those and will go ahead and be emboldened to go out to apply. But sometimes people with disabilities who may have not had great experiences before might be discouraged by that. So those instrumental or factual information, we should be thoughtful about what is a real requirement of the job and what is maybe something that you could have a conversation, what else do people bring to the table, so you don't needlessly discourage people. On the subjective side, I started talking about what are some of the symbolic things that are flags. I'll add to that flexibility in the workplace.
Huge. That's
for
number one.
all of us, for
Yeah.
all of us. Work-life balance signals that there are resources to support people, an accommodation process, an employee resource group that addresses disability interests. Those are some of the other features and facts in the subjective realm that talk about what's in this job, what's in this workplace for this person.
Okay, generally speaking, what are some challenges that everybody faces? Everybody or a lot of people in our audience will think about this. Recruiting online, it's pretty tricky, but it's how you do it. What are some common challenges that organizations are facing as it relates to this right now?
Oh, I think that we've now had enough experience with algorithmic screening. We know that it's helpful. I mean, some companies get just thousands of applications for jobs, but we also know that we're losing a lot of candidates with who have non-traditional backgrounds in this process. The very diversity that we know will bring creativity and an expanded labor pool to the organization. We are sometimes with these screening tools working against ourselves. So part of it is that screening process. Part of it is how the organization presents itself and maybe discouraging some of this talent, as we just talked about. And part of it is preparing your recruiters and hiring managers so they understand that you really want more of an openness about who can be a part of that workforce.
I have a question from Julie who checks in and asks, how does a separate portal for persons with disabilities impact our compliance in regards to our system of record documented processes? Getting in the weeds a little bit, but so if we're talking about record keeping around this, are there particular challenges within having an external portal for people with disabilities versus what might otherwise be a traditional channel?
And Julie, that's a great question, which has
It's a tough one.
Yeah, it is a tough one.
Yeah.
But it's certainly been asked by many of the legal consultants, the lawyers of companies, because they wanted to be sure that they weren't running afoul of equitable recruiting practices. And indeed, companies can have these specialized portals. People are self-electing to identify as a person with a disability. So it's really up to them whether or not that they come in through these portals. It makes it easier for companies to know that this labor pool are identifying this people coming in through this portal are identifying as a person with a disability. They don't have to come in through that portal. They can come in through the generic portal if they choose not to. But it makes it easier for companies to know if they have this kind element of diversity in their talent pipeline. And for federal contractors, or actually for the federal government, who really are looking to approximate percentages of people with disabilities in their recruitment efforts, this makes it easier. And it is perfectly appropriate from a legal compliance point of view.
Good, because I was going to ask about the compliance component of Julie's question, and that's what it's all about, right?
Right.
Perfect. We had discussed in our pregame huddle a little bit about third-party HR organizations that some of us work at companies that are small, right, and outsource or have third-party vendors who work in this space contract with organizations, right? Take care of a lot of the administrative functions, the hiring functions, to some degree, the strategic functions. Are any of those kind of organizations doing, frankly, a better job than some of our own organizations might do? How do they stack up?
I think it's certainly mixed. I think some of them perhaps aren't thinking about this. I think the employer who is hiring third-party vendors, if they are affirmatively recruiting, need to guide that recruiter.
Okay.
Tell them that they want to be affirmatively including this part of the diversity of the population. I do also know that others that are using AI tools and are being secured by companies because they are using more innovation, different kinds of ways of approaching it. It could be video capture, 2 or 3 minute interviews. It might be different kind of screening tools online. I know many of these companies have confronted this already and are really working to try to minimize any bias in those processes. none of it is perfect, but each of these are tools that can be useful to employers, may be useful to candidates if we pay attention to the ways in which we've inadvertently screened out people in the past.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we know all these algorithmic tools might have biases, potentially can have biases built in.
Right.
And so people who may have non-traditional resumes or work experience often might be set aside, where in an more personalized interview opportunity, we recognize that there is a good match there that might not have been adequately reflected on a resume that would have been screened out with AI tools.
I have another viewer who checks in, Lita Gibbs checks in and says, is it safe to say that if you disclose that you have a disability, that you will truly be given any priority in the application process? What does that process look like once TA receives the app of a person with a disability? Forgive me, I don't know what TA is, do you?
Technical assistance, I'm not sure.
I'm not certain, but the idea about priority within an application process?
So that's great.
It depends on the organizational, whatever their objectives are.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. If the organization does have an affirmative hiring program,
Yeah.
it is very likely that there is this conduit where the resume is more likely to get screened by an individual and not just an automated process.
Yep.
That hopefully those recruiters and hiring managers have been trained to know about the fact that this is strategic imperative, and that there is a greater opportunity that that person will be considered and afforded an opportunity to talk about their skills or demonstrate their skills. That is what I have observed in more affirmative hiring, targeted hiring opportunities, whether it's disability or neurodiversity. We've seen a lot of this in the last 12 years in tech companies that have been affirmatively hiring neurodivergent individuals, autistic individuals.
Talent acquisition.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, good. All right, so we had a little clarity. Thanks for the clarity on that one. I want to talk about downstream a little bit. When a person does self-identify, what does it mean for the employer? What does it mean for the employee? What actually happens?
Well, that very much depends on the person who is disclosing and on the context, absolutely. Yeah. And it's always a personal choice, particularly for individuals who have non-obvious disabilities. First of all, because we do so much remotely now,
yes.
It may not be obvious, even if the person has an obvious disability in the virtual interview space, or if the person's working 100% remotely, and they don't need an accommodation. No one even with an obvious disability. With a non-obvious disability, the person has more of an opportunity to choose whether or not they disclose. And we always say it's very much a personal choice. I would say if the person needs an accommodation, it's great for them to be in a context where they can get what they need to stay productive and to thrive in that job, but also to be able to fully represent who they are, right, as an individual. We all want to be accepted for every part of our personal characteristics, but we choose carefully what we might share, and disability is no exception. If a person has to feel comfortable to be able to do so in that work environment.
And I think accommodation is a great place to start, right? And that's also, what do you want your workplace experience to be, right?
Exactly.
Not that I have a secret, but I want to bring my whole self to work, which we're all encouraged to do all the time. And I think more so than ever, we are able to do that, I think, in many different ways.
I think we are definitely making gains, but we have still some things to keep tweaking and refining. And this conversation is a great example of how to promote that.
I hope we're not getting outside of your purview with another legal compliance question, but I think
I'll do my best.
Let's see how we do.
I am not a lawyer. I'm a psychologist.
All right, Dee. Thanks for this question. Speaking of legal compliance, Dee is curious. I'm just curious about how the affirmative action within the recent Supreme Court decisions affect active recruitment of specific groups like those with disabilities. Are you familiar with any Supreme Court cases that may affect this particular job applicant pool?
I believe I understand this scenario that has occurred recently with the Supreme Court cases.
What is it?
They seemed more focused on race and gender and the affirmative recruitment that has gone on race and gender rather than disability. within the federal government and within federal subcontractors, there is still aspirational goals of 7% for subcontractors and 12% in the federal workforce for people with disabilities. There have not been any changes to date in those aspirational goals. And disability crosses all the other kinds of differences. So I think if we were going to start eliminating people with disabilities, we'd be eliminating a lot of people. I said 11%, of the working age population are people with disabilities, but disability touches the workforce more broadly and employers than that. I've used this statistic before, Chris, and you probably might recall that 1 in 4 households has a person with a disability. So if we were to start saying we won't support or include people with disabilities in our workforce, it wouldn't just be that 11%. It would really be many more people would feel the impact of that kind of exclusionary sort of thinking. So I think disability is the great equalizer, right? I don't feel that those changes are impacting disability now.
You brought us a bunch of cool tools and resources that our viewers can use afterward. I want to dig into those a little bit because I think they're really useful. And I think for nothing else, it gets us thinking about the way that we should be thinking about this. So we have a couple tools that contain some best practices for demonstrating disability hiring priorities that are readily visible on the main career page or career resources page. We have something, first of all, let's talk about the Office of Disability Employment Policy. Governmental organization or agency or administration, what's the function of this organization?
The Office of Disability Employment Policy is within the U.S. Department of Labor.
Yep.
Its relationship to us at Cornell University is it has funded us 15 of the last 20 years to work on a project called the Employer Assistance Resource Network on Disability Inclusion, which is a concerted effort to conduct research and design online tools, informational assets, share information on social media and webinars about what is inclusive, disability inclusive, neurodiversity inclusive policies and practices for workplaces that can help get that talent in the front door and keep people there who are people with disabilities.
Okay, so that's where you start. Then we've got some other resources that are a little more, that were published a little more in partnership with some of our friends over at the ILR School at Cornell, right? So a good resource is called the Checklist for Employers, facilitating the hiring of people with disabilities through the use of e-recruiting screening systems, including AI. What's this one about? We're going to share the URL, by the way, in the chat.
Absolutely. Well, I talked a little bit about what are some of the good practices that attract people, what would make them apply. Those ideas that I shared with you are based on concerted research that we did, a survey, as I mentioned, of job seekers, looking at 40 Fortune 500 company websites that we randomly selected, getting employer feedback, getting job seeker feedback and focus groups. And from all that background research, we developed a checklist that is easily accessible that says, if you're interested in making your websites more attractive, here are 20 things you can do. And that's a downloadable tool. It's available open source.
Perfect. Good. Glad to share those two. We have the literature review component there. Can you speak to that one?
Sure. That's how we got started. I mean,
Okay.
that was the very first step we did, is take a look at what are people saying about what attracts people with disabilities to websites, to career sites, what makes them apply, and also what helps them feel comfortable self-disclosing if they need an accommodation or if they want special consideration through a portal or through a targeted internship. So that is the background of the who's doing what, where, from which we launched further, more in-depth research after that. And that's available in summary form online.
Are there any tools? We have viewer Alyssa who asks about protections for people with disabilities as it relates to employment. Does the ODEP website cover any of that stuff or any of the other resources?
It does, sure. The EARN website does have information about the Americans with Disabilities Act,
Yep.
with how ways that employers can be mindful of minimizing discrimination, that it can occur not only on the front end. Right now we're talking about people getting in to the workplace, but inequities can occur in all parts of the employment process. So there's lots of information on there about equitable career development, equitable access to advancement, performance reviews, as well as the front end of recruitment, interviewing, and how to be fair in that process for people with disabilities.
Good. I hope that's useful, Alyssa, who asks, who kind of preceded that with, in light of the current political landscape, it's Wednesday, and we're just getting started on this, so a lot of things could change. But as far as legal protections, that's probably going to be a developing story, to be honest.
Yes.
As we go forward.
Yes.
Accessibility, we haven't talked about that strictly, right? We're talking about hiring people with disabilities, accessibility and usability of a website. You've talked about it a little bit. For a lot of organizations, they don't do it right. It's kind of an aspirational kind of thing. And maybe we'll never get it right? This is something we're all works in progress. All of our companies and our organizations have websites that do some things good, some things bad. In your estimation, are there any shining examples? We have viewer Lilia who asks, I'd like to look at a few that might be really great websites and kind of tick all the boxes and have nailed that checklist that you talk about. Do any of the resources out here that we provided cite any shining star examples of a?
I think you will find some examples on there. I would say I'm going to point you to, I've done more in-depth research in the neurodiversity area.
Yep.
I would encourage you to take a look at the organization called Disability In. And Disability In has a neurodiversity at work roundtable, and they're at lists 3-4 dozen different companies that are affirmatively recruiting individuals with disabilities. And I think looking at those websites, you will get some ideas of, Microsoft, Ernst & Young, JP Morgan Chase, SAP. There have been a number of organizations that have been pioneers in this affirmative recruiting for people with neurodiversity, whose websites, I think, demonstrate that, and other companies that now increasingly that are listed in that. So many of them have disability more generally kinds of information, but I think that's a good place to start.
Another good place to start is Susanne and I did a neurodiversity at work keynote several months ago. It was in July. I recommend for our audience to check that out, right? So go to our website, check out the neurodiversity at work. There's a lot of overlap and crossover with what we're talking about today.
Absolutely.
Which was also released as a podcast. And if you haven't checked out our podcast, I'm plugging things here. You can. Today's episode will be a podcast within about a week or two, and certainly Neurodiversity at Work is available as a podcast on eCornell or Cornell Keynotes rather. So check out that channel. Susanne, what's next for your work at the Yang-Tan? I want to get a big picture because you do a lot of work over there. We're going to share the URL for the Yang-Tan Institute at Cornell, but an institute focused on disabilities and work. What are some of the other things you're working on? You've always got something new cooking, so I had to ask.
We do. Well, definitely for our Office of Disability Employment Policy work, we talked a lot about the online recruitment. We're doing a lot on mental health in the workplace there, which is a huge issue for employers. So at some point in the future, that might be a great conversation for us to have there. Mm-hmm. We're doing more on small businesses, too, because many people, although we're often talking about the big companies and their affirmative hiring, small businesses are what employ, a great many of our Americans. And so looking at what can we do to support small businesses in affirmative hiring, we'll be working on that. And closer to this neurodiversity area, we have a National Science Foundation grant that we're partnering with organizations like the National Association of Colleges and Employers to look at ways to improve how we prepare young people for STEM jobs, people are autistic or neurodivergent specifically. So we're working in that as well.
Good, because I wanted you to provide a little baseline for what people can gather from the Yang-Tan Institute website, which is a great resource within itself. So I want to share those links with our audience one more time. Encourage you to go check out the Yang-Tan Institute and some of Suzanne's work. You're also an author. There's so much going on here. But more so than anything else, I want to make sure that our audience was able to not learn everything there is to learn about, hiring online for people with disabilities, but to take the next step and elicit further learning. So I want you to check out Suzanne's certificate programs, and hopefully we've provided enough resources with you to send you on your way, whether you're an employer or on the employee side. Susanne Bruyère, great to have you in the studio today.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be back.
Thank you, viewers. We'll see you next time on Keynotes.